Welcome back to the show. Week 10 still going strong. I don't know if you noticed, but the world is on fire right now, and I don't mean just alive with activity. I mean literally on fire. Several different regions that we're going to get to. Very tragic stories, unfortunately. This is not going to be one of those light weeks where we talk about the world's ugliest dogs or people being named after characters from Game of Thrones. This is one of the serious ones. But these are the stories of the day, and so that's what we're going to cover. And we're going to be starting off in Egypt. Every day over the last week or two in Egypt has brought new revelations, both good and bad, for people hoping for democracy in Egypt, those in Egypt, perhaps on the Muslim Brotherhood side, hoping for the continuation of Islamic dominance of Egyptian government. Both of you got some good news in the last few days. The most important news of the day, though, is that Egypt now has an interim prime minister to join its recently appointed interim president, the president being Adli Mansour, a man I'm not particularly knowledgeable about, unfortunately, but the new interim prime minister I do know a little bit about. Now, this is Mohammed El Baradei. That's a name that might be familiar to you. Perhaps he's been in a number of news stories over the last few years, most notably as the former director of the UN's nuclear watchdog agency. Now, that obviously a very important agency when it comes to Middle Eastern politics, trying to control Iranian nuclear development and things of that sort. But he also, if you're hoping for real substantive democracy in Egypt, there are certainly worse people that we could have gotten. So El Baradei has been around. He has the credentials in advocating for democracy in Egypt stretching back over 4 years. He was one of the people protesting against Hosni Mubarak at that time. And when Mohamed Morsi came to power, he was one of the people speaking out against that. Turns out that things worked out pretty well for him since Morsi was overthrown recently. Now, El Baradei is not very well known in the West, I suppose, in government terms, like in terms of interacting with Western leaders or anything like that. But he is considered to be a liberal. He is considered to be very pro-reform, especially in comparison to some others who had been considered possible interim prime ministers leading up to the elections that currently do look like they will happen in Egypt. So that is the good news, I suppose. He is a person that I think that the United States will be willing to work with. Leading up to that, by the way, President Barack Obama was very careful in the way that he described the changeover in political power in Egypt, refusing to use the word coup, something that, as you might expect, he has been attacked for in the conservative blogosphere, the conservative radio shows, and things of that sort. So that's good news. There is some bad news, though. If you've been watching, there has been significant violence in Egypt after Morsi was taken out of power. Just in a recent day, up to 36 people are believed to have died in skirmishes and some of the protests in the cities across Egypt. Now, that certainly could be worse, but it is a significant loss of life. Protests for Morsi, for him to be released and reinstated into power, have been going on in a number of different cities. Clashes between those pro-Morsi protest groups and people looking for actual democracy in Egypt have been happening. Now, it hasn't devolved into open warfare on the streets because the Egyptian military has been very watchful for that, especially in Cairo, but that's still a possibility. Now, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, their leadership have been getting arrested over the last few days, which I suppose is a good thing for the development of democracy in Egypt. We have some quotes from the current chief of the Brotherhood, Mohammed Badai. He said on Friday, he was speaking to some supporters of Morsi in front of a mosque in Cairo. He says, "God make Morsi victorious and bring him back to the palace. We are his soldiers. We defend him with our lives." So that's not good. He wasn't doing a very good job in Egypt. I don't think that at this point you should be willing to throw down your lives, especially because with the military not backing him, it seems extremely unlikely that he will ever have a position of relevance or power in Egypt. So that is the current situation in Egypt. Violence continuing, that's certainly not a good thing. But for those of you who out there who are worried that once the coup happened, the military might be unwilling to relinquish power, Mohammed El Baradei getting the position of interim prime minister would seem to be an indication that that is not going to happen. And by the way, one final note, while all of this is going on, the trial of former President Hosni Mubarak in the killing of a couple of protesters in 2011 during the uprising that ousted him from power has been going on. No news whatsoever on that. It seems so interesting that at the time of like this magnificent and huge shaking political change in Egypt, his trial's just humming along in the background. So perhaps there will also be justice there eventually. But the fire continues a little bit closer to home. We're going to roll the footage now. The footage that you're watching is the fire that resulted when a train carrying crude oil from North Dakota to a small town in Quebec derailed, exploded. There have been some subsequent explosions in the area, possibly other cars in the train, possibly other cars and things like that in the area around where the train derailed. Information still coming in on that. We don't have a lot of firm details. But it is a small town in Quebec. Up to 1,000 people, by the way, have been evacuated from the area because of worries of further explosions. And aside from the explosions and the fire, there's also the worry of both the immense amount of smoke being belched into the air and also crude water entering the waterway nearby there. So Quebec's provincial police chief, Michel Brunet, has been talking about that, saying that currently details about loss of life are extremely limited. We don't have any confirmations about people having died in this tragedy, but we do have people who are currently missing, and they're being looked for. The police chief says, "We're told some people are missing, but they may just be out of town or on vacation. We're checking all that, so I can't tell you at the moment whether there are any victims or people who are injured." Now, considering the size of the explosion, the size of the fire's loss of life does seem likely, unfortunately, at this point. It's a small community, but there were people nearby, let alone on the train, who might have died in the derailment and the subsequent explosion. So obviously a great tragedy. Now, the town mayor of Lac Mégantic says, this is Roy LaRouche, says, "When you see the center of your town almost destroyed, you'll understand that we're asking ourselves how we are going to get through this event." So obviously great tragedy. They have quarantined off an area around the explosion while the search for people goes on. Now, obviously, anyone who is from that area and is currently out of that area should contact friends or family to let them know that they were not injured or killed in that explosion. I think that's what people are hoping for at this point. As we said, this was carrying a great deal of crude oil from North Dakota, one of the reasons the explosion was as large as it was. And as we said, danger from smoke, danger from the fire, danger in the water nearby. So a great tragedy in Canada right now. Details still coming in, and for right now at least, that the footage has just taken over the internet. Like massive flames, massive plumes of smoke. Some of the earliest footage I saw of it coming from Vine, by the way. I think this is the first case that I've seen of Vine being used as sort of an independent man-on-the-street venue for journalism. Maybe that's a silver lining, I suppose, but obviously a great tragedy, and I worry about the potential reports of loss of life coming in the next few days. One more tragedy we have to cover, this one perhaps even more tragic. Horrible news coming out of northeastern Nigeria, the town of Potiskum. Islamic militants stormed a Western school and killed 29 children and a teacher there. The teacher is Mohammed Musa, who was shot in the chest. Some of the students also shot. Some died in the fire when the school was burned down. The Muslims brought both weapons and cans of gasoline to burn down the school. Now, this is not the first. This is hardly the first. Many have been burned down in Nigeria recently. We'll give you that information. But first, in this particular case, so the parents have been searching through the remains of this school to find out if their children are alive or dead, and because of the extent of the burning down of the school, some of the bodies cannot be identified right now. And it's also believed that dozens of the school children, by the way, this school had, I believe, well over 1,200 students. Many of them are believed to have escaped into the brush when the attack happened, and they might still be out there, and we don't currently know. The children were apparently so scared, their schoolmates being shot and being killed in the fires, that they escaped wherever they could. We have a quote from one of the fathers, Malam Abdullahi, says, "That's it, I'm taking my other boys out of the school." They were able to identify 2 of his children did die in the attack. Now, he also has 3 younger children in a nearby school. He says he's taking them out now. He says it's not safe. The gunmen are attacking schools, and there's no protection for students despite all the soldiers. Now, very little information about the current military situation in Nigeria gets any play whatsoever in the U.S., so I'm going to give you some details about that. So starting in May 14th, the president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, declared a state of emergency because of the extremely widespread attacks of these Islamic militants. Now, at that time, they had taken over a significant portion of the country. Some reports are saying up to 1/6 of the country was in the hands of these militants. Now, In the time from when the state of emergency was declared, thousands of troops were deployed, and they have been able to take over significant portions of the country back from the hands of the militants. They've been using both traditional ground troops, also attacks with fighter jets. Helicopter gunships have attacked some of the known bases of the militants. But unfortunately, as a consequence of this, the militants have fled to more rugged mountainous terrain where the military is unable to really pursue them effectively. And so out of those bases, they have been continuing their attacks on some of the Western schools and other areas. So we believe at this point that the gunmen that attacked the school are from the Boko haram sect, which, by the way, translates to Western education is sacrilege. So that's obviously ominous and horrible. And so, yeah, you're seeing once again in another area, this time in Africa, the clash between some Western influence in Nigeria and the traditional Islamic militants. So obviously extremely horrible news. Scores of schools in the past year have been burned down just in northeast Nigeria. I can't imagine what I would be thinking if I was a parent in that area, but I also don't know at this point what you're supposed to do. This conflict could continue for months, it could continue for years. And if the military is unable to secure these schools, as a parent, I don't know where you're supposed to put your children. You can't simply move out of the country, as many people might assume you would. And so horrible situation there. Now, as we said, the military has had some success in combating these militants. I don't know if they will be able to stamp it out entirely, because it seems like it's a well-funded and well-stocked group, but I wish them the best of luck in this struggle. Now, turning to a little bit lighter news, this is the country we're living in now, where a murder trial can be lighter news compared to some of these world news events. The prosecution is resting in the case of George Zimmerman and his trial for the murder, or at the very least killing, of Trayvon Martin. We've got some details there, and then I want to talk a little bit more generally about the case, which I've been paying some attention to. So, as I said, the prosecution is resting. The defense tried to have the charges against Zimmerman dropped. I guess that's standard operating procedure. It seems pretty ridiculous at this point. But the defense attorney for George Zimmerman, Mark O'Mara, said that there was an enormous amount of evidence that had been presented that showed that Zimmerman had acted in self-defense. And he argued that Zimmerman at the time had a reasonable belief that he was in danger, and that he acted without the ill will, hatred, and spite that would be necessary to prove the second-degree murder charge that the prosecution is trying to pin to Zimmerman. The prosecutor, Richard Manti, countered with, there are two people involved here. One of them is dead, and one of them is a liar. That seems, based on the evidence I've seen, to be pretty true. Now, that's basically what happened. And if you've been watching the trial at all, the strategy that they've taken is to discredit all of the witnesses that have tried to corroborate the case of, or the point of view of Trayvon Martin's family and what they said happened. There was absolutely shameless attacks on the female friend of his, with apparently the argument being that if you can prove that she's racist, if you can prove that she's illiterate, it wasn't murder. I don't know how that works, but the justice system in America is so perverted that that's the route that the defense took. And since then, we've seen medical examiners, some of the people who examined Zimmerman after the trial, or after the killing. And so some of that information has been very interesting. Now, I have not been following the case day to day. I haven't been watching the ridiculous HLN or CNN daily hour news coverage of the event, but I have been following some of the headlines. And what's interesting to me is that the prosecution is resting, and many people are saying, oh, they clearly didn't prove that this wasn't self-defense. But all of the evidence I've been seeing would seem to indicate that it definitely was not self-defense. And so I kind of feel like I went to sleep and woke up in bizarro Earth or something like that. To me, the most important data, outside of what we've known the entire time, like that he went out investigating and searching and following Trayvon Martin, that he called the police said stop following him, and he continued to, that seems incredibly questionable. But apparently that just doesn't matter, not relevant, has nothing to do with the case, since I don't hear it talked about at all at this point. It's all, was he called a cracker? That seems relevant, I suppose. That's the case that the defense is making. But we do know at this point there was no indication of Trayvon Martin's DNA on the gun. There was no indication of Zimmerman's DNA underneath his fingernails, Trayvon Martin's fingernails, that would seem to indicate that he was fighting fiercely. The medical examiner said that the injuries to Zimmerman were insignificant, that they were superficial, which goes against what we had heard when they months ago released the picture of him all bloodied and trying to make the case look obviously he was being attacked viciously. And yet, with all of this evidence, we're supposed to believe that it was still self-defense. Look, I have problems both with this individual case and problems with the way that we cover murder trials in America. I think that apparently the country has soured somewhat on reality TV, and now we want it to be even more real. And so we engage in this. At any given time, we choose one trial. It becomes basically courtroom porn, and we follow every single step of the way, getting into the personal lives of every witness and that sort of thing. Now, I understand that there's big money in it. I don't just blame HLN. I don't just blame CNN. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching their completely unnecessary daily hour-long coverage of the trials. And so they have a monetary incentive to continue covering it the way that they have. But it does bother me that America is just gobbling this up the way that they are. But specifically in regards to the trial, I think that self-defense is supposed to mean something. And this trial is teaching me that it apparently in America does not mean anything, especially if you're holding a gun. There will, of course, be multiple days, if not weeks, of the defense presenting their case. The prosecution had their try. I think they presented a pretty compelling case that this wasn't self-defense, but we're going to have to see what the jury thinks at this point. So anyway, I think that both on the media end of this, what it says about the American people, and also what it says about the jury and how they seem to be unconvinced by what the prosecution has presented up until this case, up until this point, it's all bad news. Anyway, some actual good news we have for you. Just about 10 days ago, a little bit less than 2 weeks ago, we had DOMA being struck down. Great news for America, progress being made. Now, at the time, I was one of the people saying, let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is not the slam dunk win for equal marriage rights that some people were making it out to be. If you actually read the rulings, they were pretty specific in what they were making clear they wanted this to be applied to in the future. So on the case of DOMA, you had the extension of federal tax benefits and other sorts of financial benefits to people who had had gay marriages in various states. That was obviously a good thing, but they tried to make it clear in that case that they were not saying that states can't outlaw gay marriage. What's interesting is that despite the Supreme Court, in particular Kennedy, who wrote one of the opinions, his attempts to make it very constrained in what it could be applied to, already it's being applied to a number of different equal marriage equality trials that are being conducted right now. And so the particular line that's being quoted in many of these is when Kennedy said that the provision denying federal benefits to legally married same-sex couples in different states humiliates tens of thousands of children now being raised by same-sex couples. And again, he was trying to be very specific there, supposedly. I personally am starting to think that he just did it to convince the conservative justices on the court. And maybe he anticipated or hoped that it would be interpreted more widely. But that's what's happening right now. So John Davidson is the legal director for Lambda Legal. He says that one of the reasons that it can be used now to challenge some of the state-level bans on same-sex marriage is that it's stigmatizing and it's harmful to people, and particularly harmful to children, when the parents' relationship is treated as inferior by the government. Those points are points we'll be making in all of our marriage cases. And so this is not the first time, by the way, that this sort of fairly well-crafted and tailored language in a Supreme Court opinion will be used much more broadly. The same sort of thing happened in the wake of 2003's Lawrence versus Texas, and we actually have some interesting stats on that. So if you go back to 2003, 13 states at that time still had laws against sodomy when the court finally switched over and said that the states can't have laws that intrude on the private personal conduct of people based on their sexual orientation in that way. If you go back a little bit farther, go back to 1967, interracial marriage was still legal in 16 different states when finally the Supreme Court ruled on it. Go back again, 1954, when the court issued the Brown decision, getting rid of some of the state-sanctioned segregation. 17 states still had formally segregated school systems. And so what's interesting is that the Supreme Court they'll hear cases sort of on the periphery of these big civil rights issues. And that's typically how this happens. You have years or decades of these peripheral cases being ruled on, and then steadily the language used in the opinions accumulates and eventually is used in a landmark decision. And in all of these cases, the Supreme Court was fairly clear, implicitly or even explicitly, that they did not mean to make any sort of landmark decision, until finally you have an accumulation, a gathering of momentum judicially, and eventually they do make that big decision. And so right now, it seems like the Supreme Court made the move that they're going to make when it comes to gay marriage, and so God knows when finally they'll make sort of, again, a Brown-level landmark decision. And so people are starting to speculate, now that this is being used, the language of Kennedy is being used in these other court cases, what will it take for that sort of tipping point? Some people believe that it'll take, we have here, one of the civil rights fighters, Tushnet, says 40 states allowing it. And if you look back at the 3 different cases that we talked about of those landmark decisions finally being made, you had 13 states remaining being against civil rights or same-sex equality, 16 states, 17 states, so it might not even take that long. And now, look, right now we only have 13 states where same-sex marriage is legal, but the acceleration has been happening. And so in a decade or two, is it inconceivable that we could have 30 to 40 states? No, I don't think that it is at all. And sort of oddly enough, Kennedy's language that was used diplomatically to bring some of the conservative justices over to his side might be what is required when that tipping point is reached to have an actual federal allowance, a constitutionality ruling in the Supreme Court for gay marriage. Scalia is going to be pretty pissed when that happens. That'll be kind of a sweet little silver lining on the whole event. I'm going to take a short little break. Once again, voice kind of giving out. We'll be back in just a minute. We've got gun nuts. We've got just a ridiculous case from Mississippi, and also an update, some good news for Paula Deen. We'll be back in just a minute. Back on the show, a couple more stories I want to cover, including some awesome footage that was released on July 4th. So we're actually going to start with that. Take a look at this.
We will not be silent. We will not obey. We will not allow our government to destroy our humanity. We are the final American Revolution. See you next Independence Day.
Now, the footage that you saw there was uploaded by Adam Kokesh. It shows him in Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C., loading a shotgun in front of government buildings. Yeah, and he chose to upload that. That was his choice. I think firmly cementing him that when you think of the term gun nut, Adam Kokesh should probably leap into your mind. The interesting first comment that has to be made on this is that, of course, it is illegal to walk around in Washington, D.C. with a gun, particularly one that's loaded, and we have found out that the U.S. Park Police and D.C. Police are investigating the incident, and that they say that the video does appear to have been taken in Freedom Plaza. So we're going to actually round back to that in a little bit. It's going to have an interesting consequence for him, but the first question is, he's obviously trying to make a statement, the fact that he's uploading it on July 4th, that he's out there loading the gun, but why is he loading the gun? He's not just holding the gun. Like, you load the gun immediately prior to having to use it in some way, but he's clearly not going to do that. It's just supposed to be this sort of empty, like, badass gesture, like, oh, that looks kind of cool. Like, what it makes me think of is any movie or show where someone's like watching someone across the street and then a bus goes by and the person's gone, and it's supposed to be all mysterious, even though when you actually think about it, that means that that person must have run really fast to get out of the way before the bus was moved, which actually isn't quite as cool. Yeah, loading a gun on tape with no intention to actually use it is about as cool as that bus thing. And so you might have remembered that he was originally going to have a march on Washington on July 4th. He announced it, that he was going to get all these people with guns and they were going to march on the government buildings. That didn't actually happen when the D.C. police said, yeah, we're just going to arrest all of you because you can't have guns in D.C. And so he went on a radio program and he was like, yeah, you guys can still do it, but I'm not going to do it so much. His plan then went to, he was going to lead an army of secessionist rallies at state capitals around the country. Now, there have been a couple of protests, but they've had very lackluster attendance and that sort of thing. And I don't know that he actually went to any of them, so he abandoned his group yet again. But here he is making the video saying that he's going to see you next Independence Day, which, again, is not a particularly badass gesture, saying, like, look at me, all ominous, I'll see you in a year. Anything could happen in a year. One thing that's probably going to happen that year, you're probably going to be arrested for having a gun in D.C. So I wouldn't make any plans that stretch out more than a few days in the future, because the D.C. Parks Police might be knocking on your door pretty soon, Adam Kokesh. And look, so the reason I'm doing this video is obviously he's a knucklehead, he's a goofball, I want to make fun of him. But let's not forget that he has made clear that despite the fact that he makes these gestures and then backs off, violence is not out of the realm of possibility for him. Let's go back to a quote he gave a couple of months ago. He said, "Should one whole year from this July 4th pass while the crimes of this government are allowed to continue, we may have passed the point at which nonviolent revolution becomes impossible." And so there, like, the police have to take him seriously. He's got a gun in open. He says that nonviolent revolution could become impossible within the next year. And so he seems like a goofball, but sometimes the people that do crazy violent things look that way before the event happens. And so they should take this very seriously. I think that he's obviously a bit delusional. The fears that he has of the government are a bit delusional. Now, what's interesting is that he's been protesting since before all the NSA stuff came out. If he did it in response to that, I'd have a little bit more sympathy for him. But his tone hasn't changed from the actual revelations of government corruption and intrusion into our privacy. And so he loses a little bit of credit from me for that. But anyway, we're going to give you an update if he does get arrested. He's been arrested in the past for some of his protests, although in that case it had to do with marijuana, actually, oddly enough, where I have, again, a little bit more sympathy for him. But yeah, the next week is going to be very interesting for Adam Kokesh. Another place interesting stuff is happening. Lest the Supreme Court decisions of the last few weeks lead you to falsely believe that America is progressing uniformly towards some wonderful liberal future, the Missouri Attorney General is saying that we need to bring back the gas chamber because other forms of capital punishment are currently tied up in court battles. Not joking, he really wants to bring back the gas chamber. So they had gas chambers back in 1965. They shut down the last prison there that was using them. And now, after more than 40 years, they might be bringing them back. And the reason is the drug propofol, which is one of the drugs that's used for lethal injection. One of the main companies that was manufacturing that and some of the other drugs that are used in the cocktail of drugs that they use, it's not being sold for the use for death penalty anymore, or for lethal injection anymore. And so that's making it a little bit harder for them. Now, interestingly, first of all, no country other than the US, and I suppose in a perverse sense back during the Holocaust, Germany, has used the gas chamber for executions. So we have, I guess we're #1, since we've used it more recently than Germany. It had previously been used in California until eventually in 1996. One of the California federal appeals courts in California in 1996 ruled that under the 8th Amendment it was cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the last time that it was actually used in America was in Arizona in 1999. Thankfully, it was stopped after that, and in that case it was actually a German national, and I think he was doing it to make a statement. But to give you some information about why we don't use the gas chamber in lieu of using lethal injection, sometimes it takes people up to 10 minutes to die in the gas chamber. One of the guys that was working at these executions says that after one time it took 11 minutes, he said that he would never do it again. And up until that point, he had been okay with the death penalty being instituted in that way. So anyway, as we said, Missouri is going to be using the gas chamber. What's interesting is that the Attorney General is doing this not because he thinks that it's a better form of the death penalty or a better way to institute the death penalty, but that just because they're having to wait too long for the drugs to do lethal injection. What's the fucking rush? Like, it's not like, oh, we can't kill him with lethal injection, so, I mean, it might take a few years. I guess he's just going to be walking the streets. He's in jail the entire time. I guess for some people, like, the way that they see the world, like, they can't wait, I suppose, but it seems like something that you could wait a few months, maybe get a shipment of the drugs later on. But no, like, among the more barbaric forms of killing people that the state can possibly use is the gas chamber. But yeah, that may be coming to Missouri sometime soon. That's the America we live in. On the one hand, get a little bit of marriage equality. On the other hand, we kill people by gassing them. That's the world we live in. And finally, the last story of the day, what I'm hoping is going to be the last story that has to do with Paula Deen, but this one's actually really interesting. It's a little bit of good news for her. Paula Deen has not been having a good month, but finally things are turning up a little bit good for her. Thomas George Paculis was recently arrested. He was trying to blackmail her, saying that he had information about some of the things that she had said that would hurt her even more than the quotes we've already been exposed to in print and in video. I can't believe what those could have possibly been, but he thinks it was worth up to $250,000, which is what he was asking Paula Deen to pay him. Now, we've got an email that he sent to Deen's lawyer, Greg Hodges, and understand that immediately after this email, they began working with the FBI to snare this guy. By the end of this, you're going to realize that he's a complete knucklehead. He doesn't know. He's a terrible criminal, as so many tend to be. But the email that he initially wrote back on June 24th, several days after the first Paula Deen statements came out, said, "I'm about to go public with statements refuting your client's statements about using the N-word in her business practices at Ladies and Sons. The statements are true and damning enough that the case for Jackson will be won on its merit alone." He eventually went on to say that the statements that he had access to that he would publish would damage your client in so many ways that it would sink your ship before it left the dock. Now, as I said, after that initial email, the lawyer for Paula Deen communicated with the FBI. The FBI informed him that you should continue to work with this guy, email back and forth. And eventually, when they negotiated the price from $250,000 down to just $200,000, they were talking with Paculis about how they were going to transfer the money. And he said that he was currently house sitting in New York, didn't have a car, and didn't know how he was going to collect the money. Shouldn't you plan? If you're going to blackmail like a big celebrity like Paula Deen, shouldn't you have a plan for how you're actually going to get the cash from her? Like, you have to assume that when you blackmail a celebrity like this, if it doesn't go through the way you want, there's actually a paper trail and you get caught, you're going to go to jail. So maybe plan ahead a bit. So eventually they did arrest him. He's being charged with extortion right now. I don't know what the penalties for that is. I assume he's going to go to jail for quite a while. But anyway, it is interesting that after the last few weeks where this horrible news about Paula Deen has come out, she's lost her book deals, she lost her Food Network thing, she lost her endorsement with the diabetes company. Finally, some good news for her. The man that was trying to blackmail her is going to jail. And finally, I want to say a little bit, I guess, against what I'd been saying about Paula Deen. So I feel kind of bad for her because I think that it's perfectly fine for the Food Network to cut her contract. I think it's perfectly fine for her book deal to be taken away because those companies made the, I believe, responsible decision that being associated with the Paula Deen name was going to lose the money, and they're perfectly free to do that. But like the porn like deals that are being offered to her, the guy trying to blackmail her and everything, like, I feel bad mostly in this whole thing about the employees of hers that were discriminated against. I'm not as concerned about her personal beliefs about African Americans. I think that that's getting into the area of thought crime. But like, let's back off with the blackmail and with the porn deals. She's already been through a lot. She's gonna lose a ton of money. Now, in the end, she is gonna be fine because she's a millionaire. And as I predicted last week, in 6 months or a year, she's probably gonna have a new book coming out. And by the way, as a little side note, her previous book is like selling at all-time highs now, so everything's not horrible for her. But the blackmailing is completely unnecessary. I am a little bit curious about what those statements were, but considering the way that he tried to conduct this whole business deal, I have a feeling he didn't really have anything anyway. So that's all the news we have for this week. I apologize for how serious it was. Sometimes that's the way the world is. And considering the protests in Brazil, Turkey, Egypt, Bulgaria, it's a very serious situation we have going on. I don't have enough details to report on the plane that just crashed while landing in San Francisco, and I didn't want to do a completely shoddy job of it. But that's going on. We had the train crash, very serious week. And while I guess I could have lightened it up with some of the fun stories we do, after I finish talking about Islamic militants killing students in Nigeria, don't really want to talk about the world's ugliest dog anymore. So, very serious week. Perhaps next week will be a little bit lighter. And as always, if you have suggestions for stories you'd like to see covered on a future edition of the show, feel free to let me know via Twitter or in the comments of one of these videos. I take a look at them all the time. I try to respond to as many as I can. And so maybe I can take your suggestions. And I look forward to covering the news next week for you. See ya.